but there are many ways, to define, this sort of the other is, when the people are in the grip of certain kind of tribalistic nativist ideology, country for natives, there are many ways to define who the other is, and, ignore the similarities between people and dwell on the differences to go after, the so-called other. So in my view, the homogeneity or the heterogeneity of a population is kind of very much a mental construct. It is a mentality that is prone to do that, can find foreigners everywhere. And so, there you had Bal Thackeray. Now, India is, of course, a very linguistically, religiously, culturally diverse country. And such an ideology obviously has, if there is such an ideology already on the ground, it has, it's a very fertile ground for it. You can slice and dice the citizens of India many different ways and define the other in many different ways. But what is strange about the West is, and the rise of nativism in the West is that England and America have been until recently a relatively homogeneous country on all the sort of the major features that divide human beings. So English has been overwhelmingly until recently the dominant language of England and of America. The dominant religion has overwhelmingly been Christianity. There was great sectarian warfare among Catholics and Protestants, right up till the Enlightenment, 16th century, 17th century. All of that is a thing of the past. And so, but when this, when this nativist tribalist ideology raises its head, it has to find something. And so the same kind of tropes that Bal Thackeray is deploying towards non-Maharashtrians, they have now started deploying towards non-citizens, foreigners. So the other in these countries are now foreigners. So at root, as far as I'm concerned, all three share some very common premises and very common mentality. Now, I'm painting with a very, very broad brush over here, so let me just throw out some caveats before we move on. I do think there are important differences between Shiv Sena and Brexit and Trump. I see Shiv Sena as the most pernicious of all three because of its open embrace of a politics of violence. And I see Brexit perhaps as the least pernicious of all three. There are some very, very legitimate reasons for the British to opt out of the European Union, the most important of which, in my view, was that the bureaucrats in Brussels, in the name of fair trade, had started imposing regulations on British businesses that would put India's pre-liberalization license Raj to shame, right? I mean, it was, they would have like a 20-page document for how to make widgets, which every country had to, European country had to follow before they could trade in that product. What's more, since these bureaucrats operated from a completely independent political jurisdiction, it was very difficult to make them accountable to British voters or to normal political checks and balances. The parliament in UK can't really control what Brussels bureaucrats are doing. That said, there is no doubt that Brexit, there were also many advantages of being in the European Union. And, so it was sort of a mixed bag. But what really clinched the Brexit movement was that it was led by Nigel Farage, who headed the United Kingdom Independence Party, which had been stoking anti-immigrant and racist sentiment to appeal to working class voters in England. So that was a core part of its appeal, and and they were pointing to some pretty unimpeachable facts in stoking the sentiment, largely that the European Union, after Britain joined, it didn't fully join the European Union, but it became part of the Union. Immigration increased many-fold to the United States, to the United Kingdom. The percentage of migrants entering the UK from Europe spiked from a little over 25% to a little under 50% from Europe after. And what was also feared was that as more countries, Turkey and what have you, join the European Union, there would be even more so-called mass migration to Europe. And so he stoked all these fears, quite a bit. Didn't help that England was facing economically hard times. No, and like Brexit, I also think there are some legitimate reasons why Americans voted for Trump. There was fatigue with the left's regime of political correctness, and we can go into this a little bit more in the Q&A. Obama had a very disastrous foray into healthcare reform. Obamacare is a highly unpopular law in the United States. He was also, he was kind of called the king of regulations. I mean, no president has regulated as much as Barack Obama. And he also continued a somewhat watered down form of a neoconservative foreign policy. So he, there was hope was he got the Nobel Peace Prize, right, even before he was in office, just because people thought he would bring peace after 8 years of the Bush regime, and he didn't. He was, he has continued, fairly militaristic foreign policy, and there is no, there's very little appetite for that in the United States. All that is sort of in disrepute. And all of those things, Trump exploited, and those are legitimate concerns. But Trump also stoked anti-immigrant sentiment, and he used many of the same ideas. That immigrants are a threat. They are taking away our jobs. All of that, those same tropes that you heard in Brexit and you heard in Shiv Sena, Trump used as well. And, and he has now declared what Bal Thackeray declared, which is that America is, American jobs, as if jobs come with nationalities written on them, right? That those jobs in America are for Americans first and foreigners afterwards, if ever. But nativism is like, in my view, is like a serpent that's chasing its own tail and then ends up devouring itself. Because who are these natives, and why, and what is this land, and why is, why are only the natives entitled to this land? Land is a physical entity, but countries are just a line on a map. India once spanned the entire subcontinent, and Maharashtra wasn't actually inhabited by modern-day Marathis, but other Dravidian races. So if Maharashtra is for original natives, then Shiv Sena has to deport itself from Mumbai, right? On the other hand, if all of those who are currently there are entitled to, to a piece of Maharashtra, then, he has no cause. The same story can be told about American white nativists, given that they are not the original inhabitants of America. American Indians are. And modern day America is emphatically a creation of, immigrants from all over the world. So what does it mean to say that, America belongs to natives and not anybody else? Why not say it belongs to whoever has made it, which would, be pretty much everybody over there, right? Why does an 8th generation German immigrant more entitled to a piece of America than, Indra Noorani, who has, created, the vice president of Pepsi, has contributed in a major way, created many, many jobs. Why is America not more hers than, somebody else's? So it is all pretty arbitrary. It's arbitrary, and these definitions, once you get down to thinking about them, there are no principal distinctions that nativists can really draw to it. All eventually must boil down to some ideology of violence, whether it is covert or overt, and I will come to that in a bit. But setting all that aside, the fact is that contrary to the nativist notion that immigration actually hurts native wages and jobs, the reality is actually almost the exact opposite. There is an overwhelming consensus among economists that immigration is a great blessing, a win-win for both immigrants and the host country. What's more, this consensus not only cuts across political lines, but also methodological ones, with classical liberal, neoclassical, Chicago school, Austrian, Keynesians, all agreeing that relatively unfettered labor mobility maximizes economic growth. Adam Smith, you all heard of Adam Smith, I hope? Yes, good. In his Wealth of Nations, he opposed not only mercantilist restrictions on capital, but labor as well. Ludwig von Mises, have you guys heard of him? Yes, okay. Ludwig von Mises, who's the guru of the Austrian School of Economics, advocated a system of free trade where capital and labor would be employed wherever the conditions were most favorable for production. So he said the same thing. There was only one prominent exception, one major economist who disagrees with all of this. Anybody have any guesses who that might be? Huh? No. No, Keynesians are actually pro-immigration. Okay, I will tell you. Karl Marx. Yeah, he is the only, and the great progressive economist is the, only one who has, he didn't actually treat the subject in any systematic way, but to the extent you can glean from his writings, he was not in favor of immigration. He regarded England's decision to absorb the surplus Irishmen driven out of their country during the great potato famine not as a benefit, but a ploy by the English bourgeoisie to force down wages and lower the material and moral position of the English working class. So he saw, Irish as a threat to the English working class, exactly like, Shiv Sena and Donald Trump and, and the Brexiters. The popular modern-day nativist canard that immigration from third world to rich countries is tantamount to importing poverty has its genesis actually in Marxist thought. So it is a little more than ironic that Britain and the United States, two capitalistic nations built by immigrants, have now thrown their lot not with Adam Smith or Ludwig von Mises, but actually with Karl Marx.